think we should get started because we don't have unlimited amount of time. This is Zach Mizell from Penn and the Leonard Davis Institute, along with our team here that is hosting today's webinar. And we're really pleased to launch this as part of CHERISH and CHERISH's Policy and Dissemination core as our sort of first research affiliate webinar focused on getting people to pay attention to research. We're lucky enough to have Austin Frakt. Many of you know Austin's work. He is an economist who is based out of Boston University, associate professor there. He runs the Partnered Evidence-Based Policy Resource Center at the Boston VA, and also serves on many committees and leadership positions, including the Academy Health Translation Dissemination Institute advisory board, which he chairs and which I sit on with him. And probably most relevant for today, has this really interesting, amazing career as both a productive scholar and somebody who engages outside of the academic silo by contributing to the New York Times, as well as the Incidental Economist, which is his baby, and a well-regarded blog and Twitter feed in health economics. So it's my pleasure to welcome Austin, and we'll let you go. His slides should be up.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I'm really delighted to be invited and happy to talk about this stuff. Talking about how to get people to pay attention to research is one of my favorite things to do. It's a passion of mine, but I do it, actually, as Zach said, I do it on the side myself. Normally when I start a talk like this, it's not a webinar, it's in person, and I ask the audience how many are have written an evidence-based piece for a lay audience. I ask for hands, or I might ask, if you haven't done it, how many want to do it or are trying to do it. I can't really easily do that here, but so let me ask you to do this. If you wouldn't mind, if you are any one of those types of people, you do this, or you have an intention of doing it, I would love if you'd shoot me an email. It doesn't have to be long. Actually, I prefer it short, but just let me know, hi, I saw your talk, and I'm trying to do this, and feel free to say whatever you want and ask whatever you want. And I'm also delighted to hear from you if anything I convey today is helpful. I just like the feedback, and don't be shy. Okay, so a press release is not enough. I think the title is probably self-explanatory, so let's get started. If I can get my computer to advance the slides, which I'm having trouble doing. There we go. So let's start with Gregor Mendel. Some of you might remember him from such shows as your high school freshman biology class. He's known as the father of modern genetics. He did all kinds of fascinating things with pea plants, and figured out how heredity works, at least in fairly simple cases, and kind of kicked off centuries-long exploration of genetics and heritability and so forth. You'll see why in a minute why I'm bringing him up. So he did the foundational work on heredity. His pea plant work was in 1856 to 1864. He presented it, as all good scholars would, at a conference at the Natural History Society of Brno. Of course, to satisfy his funders, I'm joking, I don't think he had any, he published his findings in an academic journal in 1866. And then a rather unfortunate thing happened. For 35 years or so, his paper got a whopping 4 citations, which even in those days was pretty lame. And that's kind of surprising for something as foundational as his work. Now we think of it as I said, kind of kicking off the kind of the biological revolution and genetic revolution. it was in 1900 that his contribution was rediscovered, and it was only then it was recognized for what it was. And it was a really nice. I learned about this actually in Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Gene, which I recommend. And he wrote, the study that founded modern biology was buried in the pages of an obscure journal of an obscure scientific society for 35 years. So I think this is a really nice cautionary tale. Had Mendel maybe been more promotional about his work, maybe translated it a little more clearly to audiences that maybe didn't understand it. If he had been on Twitter, of course he couldn't have, but I'm joking. Maybe he could have gotten it recognized earlier, and we wouldn't have, in a sense, lost almost 4 decades of the possibility of progress in this area. So let this not happen to you. Whatever you do, or your colleagues do, that's important. Don't let it sit in an academic journal, gaining almost no visibility. So why does this happen? Well, we still do what Mendel did with very little variation typically. We publish a paper, maybe go to a conference, we put out a press release. Probably Mendel didn't do that. Maybe we do a few interviews if we're so lucky, and then we just get back to work and don't look back, and certainly don't do any more promotional activities. And I think this is a kind of a flawed model, and I think we can do a lot better. There's more than 2.5 million papers published each year, and more than 28,000 legitimate academic journals, not the predatory sort, but ones that are worth publishing in. So no one's going to see your paper, unless it's in one of the really big journals. It's massively counterintuitive, kind of flashy, or really newsy. We just can't count on the standard model to break through. So just in healthcare, this graph represents out of all the healthcare stories, healthcare studies that come out in journals each year, the proportion that are reported by any media is a minuscule sliver. It's that little blue line at the top. And how much is it? It's actually 1 in about 2,500 studies get any attention, any media attention. And I don't know what the right number is, but I think it's higher than 1 in 2,500. I would be the first to say that there's many articles in journals that really don't warrant or need media attention. Some are methodological, some are just for the community, some aren't very good, some don't really advance anything. So it's fine. I'm not saying that we should reach 100%, but I think 1 in 2,500 is awfully low. And I do come across a number of studies, and I'm not even looking at all the journals. I'm looking at what I can consume. I see many things that I think warrant a little attention. I try to give some attention to what I can, but there's many more that I don't have time for, and I don't think they all get it. So there's lots of ways to make your work and the community's work more accessible. I like to write. That's what I do, but it's not the only way. There's people who make videos. My colleague Aaron Carroll makes videos. People do podcasts, and there's also many very fine traditional ways to promote your work. And I don't want anything I say today to be taken as abandoning the traditional routes as well. Certainly we should go to conferences. Certainly we should talk to journalists when they call us. Certainly we should reach out to policymakers. If we have relationships, we should use them, and so forth. But I think there are other approaches, and I'm going to talk about ways to write accessibly. So it's something I love to do, and I do regularly. I love to write. I love to write way more than I like to talk. Actually, hate talking. And my preference, really, the only thing I do is write from a basis of evidence. I'm really a scientist at heart, and it comes from my background and my educational upbringing in a way. I was just talking before we started recording. I started my secondary education at Cornell in engineering physics, and then I went on to do electrical engineering for a PhD. So Richard Feynman, the great physicist, Richard Feynman was my my hero. So I love evidence, and I like to translate it into relevance for policy. Um, and as a community, I don't think we do this enough, and I think it's really, really important. I think we should have no reason to expect that our work or the work we think is important should get funded if we don't explain what it is and what we've done with the funding in a way that everybody can understand. I don't think we should expect our work to have any influence if it's not understood. It doesn't mean just because we write something and it gets into the New York Times or elsewhere, it's going to have influence, but it is, I think, a prerequisite. Work that just sits in a journal and isn't understood isn't going to have an impact. So this is not easy. Any book about writing will tell you it's not easy, and you have to practice. And in particular, I found the book by Anders Ericsson, which I recommend, Peak, very influential in my thinking about how to practice writing. Although, as I said, you could read about it in many other places. Now, Peak wasn't about writing. It was about how to get good at anything. And it's about this idea of dedicated practice, which is to practice regularly, but pay very close attention to where you need improvement and to work on those areas. Now, this is something that's intuitive in many other areas. So one example would be, suppose you're trying to learn tennis or anything, chess, gosh, even how to play a video game or an academic subject, calculus. If you remember something like that, either those in particular or something like it that you tried to get good at, when you started, you were lousy. If it was tennis, you were hitting balls all over the place, a small percentage of them landing in the court, even those were pretty terrible shots. And that's normal. The nice thing about it is when you start out, you recognize the errors. You can see when you're screwing up, and you can see pretty easily what you need to get better at, and you can make a lot of progress without that much instruction initially. What happens is that we get to a point where we stop embarrassing ourselves at how bad we are. We actually get passably good at tennis or chess or calculus or whatever it is, and we don't really need to improve out of embarrassment, and we plateau. And we also don't really recognize where the errors are because they're not obvious. We need coaches, and we need to push ourselves in particular. And that's really what people who are expert in different areas do. They push very hard through plateaus where most of us are happy to just sit. So if you want to get better at writing, you need to do the same thing. You have to practice more or less daily. If you don't see how to get better, you need to find someone who can show you. So almost the rest of this talk is going to be about how to practice writing. And I want to I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. I want to make sure we have time for your questions because not all of you are trying to get better at writing or want to write in accessible ways for a broader audience, and that's totally fine. I don't think everybody has to do this. What I'm trying to do is, for those of you who want to do this but aren't really sure how to do it, I'm giving you ways to start. But others probably have other questions, so I'm trying to balance those. So I will go through these areas on separate slides. There's 7 of them. Some are fairly self-explanatory. I'll go into more detail about others. Read regularly and emulate, write every day, regularly revise often, work the lead. I'll explain what I mean by that, simplify, make it personal, and some technical details. And I have examples along the way of what I mean by some of these things. So read and emulate, that's really self-explanatory. If you want to get better at writing, read people who are doing the thing you want to do. And don't just pass your eyes over it, read it and really get into it and think as you're reading. Have a kind of a dialogue about. Ask yourself questions like, how did this writer do that? Like, oh, that moved me, or wow, now I understand that and I didn't before, or that was a very artful metaphor, or that transition was really cool. When you notice that, like, take a second look or a third look and try to see structurally what has been done, and try to get that voice in your head. And then the next time you write, pretend you're that person. And when you write a sentence and you're trying to write in their style, read it to yourself and say, would so-and-so write this sentence? Is this a sentence I could imagine that came from that person's fingers? If the answer is no, revise it. It's hard. I make it sound easy, but it's hard. But nevertheless, it is a way, and I still do it to this day when I write. It's how I edit very much. I say, is this the voice I'm really going for? Writing every day, or nearly, is one of my several secret weapons. I'm going to give you all my secret weapons in this talk, so you'll know what they are. And one is to write every day, and I don't mean write a lot. I just mean write. So what I also mean by this is it's not an afterthought. Make a time every day to write. And for me, when I need to get some writing done, and I'm not able to get it in otherwise, it's first thing in the morning. I make that time every morning. It's the first thing after taking care of biological needs. It's the first thing I would do. I sit down and I write, and it might only be for 15 minutes. If I'm like having a good time and I happen to wake up early, it might be longer. Dedicate 10 minutes every day to write, or see if you can write 5 sentences. And they don't have to be the final sentences, just 5, and you'll edit later. If you do that in some number of weeks, not too many, or a couple months, you'll have a whole piece. To get to 1,000 words, if you can write 50 words a day, you're going to get there in, if I do the math, 20 days, less than a month. So, as a rough draft. All right, fairly clear. Write early, revise often. Procrastination is what kills everybody in this area. I don't have a lot of success stories. I've given this talk or something like it many times. Maybe there's a few people out there who've actually broken through some barriers or put what I've said to use, and they've never told me. That's why I really like you to, if you do. But I don't hear much about it. So I think in a lot of cases what I do hear is procrastination. I can't do it because I'm too busy. I can't do it because it's too hard. I can't do it because I don't know how, and so forth. Feels true, but it really isn't. If you make those 10 minutes a day and just keep at it, it'll get done. So I like to write pieces very early. I don't write to deadlines. I've had pieces sitting around written for months before I submit them to the Upshot editors. I also revise a lot, and I get them reviewed. I usually get them peer reviewed. I pick people in the field. I think I've sent Zach. I think you were a couple of pieces I've sent to you, and I get feedback. And the editors don't ask me to do that. I just impose it on myself. So that's a way of keeping myself honest. Okay, secret weapon number 2 is about the lead. The lead of a piece, and I'm thinking, and actually, I should have made this clear. I'm really thinking mostly about column length pieces in the Upshot or someplace like that. So it's about 1,000 words, 700 to 1,000 for a lay audience. And the lead is the first paragraph, roughly, the top. In our academic publications, we never think about the lead. We think about the introduction, but lead is like, the big. What's the idea? What is this really about? And my secret weapon is I try to do leads in 3 or fewer sentences. If I can't, and the purpose of the lead is just to get people interested in reading the rest. Or actually, if I just get them to read the next sentence, I'm happy. And if that sentence gets them to read the next one, and so forth, then they'll get through the whole thing. So the lead, it's not a background. It's not it's not methods. So Lord knows it's not methods. It's like a little bit of a stylized fact maybe about what is in the piece, and it should get people to want to read the rest. And what it does for me, when I write a good lead, I want to keep writing. It doesn't just get readers to want to read, it gets me to want to write. There's something about a momentum to it. So I'm going to give you some examples. These are all from my Upshot pieces. They're a little bit dated. I haven't revised this. I picked out these leads because I thought they were decent, but it gives you a flavor of what I'm talking about. So here's one. Before they see a doctor, most patients turn to websites and smartphone apps. Caution is advised. Research shows they aren't very good. 3 sentences. I actually did it in 2 paragraphs just for some white space. I think you know what this piece is about. Unless it doesn't interest you at all, I think it would propel you to keep reading. And I certainly want to keep writing it. Okay, I have a couple here that are anecdotal leads. They're actually from my own personal life, which is about the only kind of anecdotal lead I do, because I don't see patients, I don't interview people usually, unless they're scholars. So I don't have a lot of anecdotes. This one's, after one of her operations, my sister-in-law left the hospital so quickly that she couldn't eat for days. After other stays, she wasn't discharged until she felt physically and mentally prepared. 5 days after his triple heart bypass surgery, my stepfather felt well enough to go home, but the hospital didn't discharge him for several more days. This lead doesn't exactly tell you what the piece is about, but it gives you a flavor, and I'm pretty sure the next paragraph tells you. I'm clearly talking about variations in when patients are discharged, and I'm hoping that the anecdotes here kind of draw you in. I want to give that as an example. Here's another one that's very personal from a number of years ago. At rest, I could feel my heart pounding out a double beat. It felt like falling in love, only I wasn't. This was about a heart thing that I had, and it brought me through a journey through medical technology and diagnosis and so forth, and that's that one. This one is a 1-sentence lead. If you do a 1-sentence lead, you get a gold star. You can take off the rest of the day, no more writing. If I write a 1-sentence lead, I just sit back and I just say, that's great. Considering how much we already pay for healthcare, you have to wonder why doctors, hospitals, and insurance providers so often fail to coordinate their patients' care. Well, yeah, that's a good question. We're paying so much. Why do we have to do so much work just to get the doctor's offices to talk to each other? So anyway, I think you see what I mean. That pulls people in. Oh, another 1-sentence lead. For some of the most important drugs, prices may be too low. That works because it's counterintuitive. It's not what people expect. Drug prices are too high is what we hear. How could they ever be too low? Okay, so this may be overkill. This is the last one. Your dentist has probably offered dental sealants for your child. Mine has. Without knowing whether they work, I've always accepted them. Turns out this was a good move. So actually, I violated my own rule here. This is 4 sentences. Maybe I could have worked it down to 3, but 3 is the goal. I don't know why. I just like 3. Okay, so a lot of getting a good lead is actually simplifying. It's simplifying the message down to the stylized fact or the thing that will just pull readers in. So a lot of people, academics, have trouble simplifying. We love to lard it up with nuance and caveats. So some of us, I'm not one of them, but some of us, when we speak much more simply. I think talented speakers, they know they can't give you a 50-word sentence. They have to give you the nice 5-word sentences, 8-word sentences that are very succinct, and they don't have a lot of hemming and hawing in them. So if you're like one of those people, if you write the way you speak, that'll get you a pretty long way. Another way to help simplify your style and kind of explain things in a accessible way is a question and answer style. And I do that a lot, not for Upshot, but on my own blog when I'm trying to figure out how to approach a topic. So I just imagine somebody else, my mother or a friend or my wife or one of my kids, asking the obvious questions in succession about the topic. What is this about? Why is this a big deal? Is it a big deal for everyone? What can we do about it? There's some sort of obvious introductory questions, and just pretend you're explaining that. That goes a long way to figuring out how to write it simply. When I've written a draft, or usually the way I revise is sort of, I don't write the whole draft. I like to kind of go back, write a paragraph, go back, write the next paragraph, go back over the first two, and so forth, iteratively. But when you've written a bunch, go back and read each sentence and see if you can eliminate words, make things shorter and simpler. So here's an example of a paragraph where I recall I worked pretty hard to make it simple and make the sentences short, simple words. One sentence is a little longer just because it lists a bunch of cities, but apart from that, it's fairly short. So it goes like this. Paid sick leave shows the spread of Paid sick leave slows the spread of disease. Cities and states that require employers to offer paid sick leave, I list the cities and states, have fewer cases of seasonal flu than other comparable cities and states. Flu rates would fall 5% if paid sick leave were universal. According to one estimate, an additional 7 million people contracted the H1N1 flu virus in 2009 because employees came to work while infected. The illness led to 1,500 additional deaths. Those are all really simple sentences. They're all very short, relatively short. This is not a lead paragraph. This is somewhere down. Maybe it's the second paragraph. I don't remember. You will rarely see a paragraph this simple in an academic journal, but it is, I think, effective in conveying something to a wider audience. Another really effective technique, and actually I learned about this not for writing but for speaking, but it works for writing too, is to make it personal if you can. And that could be through a personal anecdote or some way to connect yourself with the topic. I actually came to this more through speaking at a time when public speaking was more of a challenge for me, and I wasn't happy with my performance. And I talked to a colleague and a friend who happens also to be a good writer, Lisa Rosenbaum, and I just confided in her. I wasn't even expecting her to offer me any good advice, but I said, I'm really disappointed with how I speak. And she said, well, try putting yourself into the content, make it more about you. Tell a story. And she said, it will relax you, and it's a story you can tell without looking at your notes, and people like it. And she's right. She was totally right about all those things. And now that's what I do. So this talk has examples of that. I told you about my academic history. I told you about my relationship with evidence. I just told you a personal story about making it personal. It totally works. So if you can do it in writing, it'll work too, and it'll get you interested. You may already be interested in what you're writing about, but it'll give you a lot of extra motivation. I'm not shy about writing about health conditions that I'm experiencing. And so if I can do that and make a worthwhile point about the condition, about medical care, medical technology, and so forth, I'm happy to put myself in the story. Another way of making it personal in a different sense is all this stuff only works if you love it. You have to love to write. I think you have to write first for yourself. If you think, well, I'm writing because I want fame and fortune, I want people to think I'm smart, I just want to be that kind of person who has like the public persona or whatever, I think that's a harder motivation to sustain. I think if you just love to write, and you know who you are if you do, this is so much easier. And that's what I do. I really write for myself. The rest of the stuff is just it's just extra. Okay, wrapping up with the secret weapons. This is secret weapon number 4. Well, actually, this is a bunch of stuff, but I have secret weapon number 4 built into this. So some technical details. If you're really pursuing an agenda, or that's a little bit of a loaded term, or you're really trying to get a message out there, don't write just one piece and think you're done. You have to beat the drum. You have to keep doing it over and over. So, an example, a number of years ago, CMS redacted all the Medicare and Medicaid claims data, the research identifiable files of substance use related claims. If a beneficiary of either of those programs had a substance use disorder related diagnosis or procedure, those claims were taken out of the research data. That's a big deal, especially nowadays when substance abuse is a big problem and it's related to conditions that are undergoing a lot of change, like hepatitis C with the new drugs and so forth. And apart from that, it just completely alarmed me as a scientist that the data we rely on as a community was being dishonored in that way, and I was upset. So I wrote about it first on my blog, and then with Nick Bagley at NEJM and on the Upshot. And Nick wrote about it from a regulatory perspective, and maybe some of you saw these posts. And we wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and we just kept beating the drum. Eventually, CMS rolled back that decision to new regulation. In the process of all that, we attracted attention enough so that we talked to congressional staff, and other words, we played a role. I'm not saying what we did was decisive in changing the how things happened or when they happened, but we played a role, and I'm proud of that. Some point in the middle of that, or near the end, I remember Nick and I were giving a presentation about this kind of stuff, this translation dissemination stuff, and we had to share the podium, and he said, well, let me do that part since I have so much other stuff to talk about. He said, I'll do the part about the redacting of the data and all that stuff, and he said, I'm going to put up a slide that kind of just lists all the posts we did to make the point to keep beating the drum, just the titles. And I was thinking, that's cool. It's probably 6, 8, 10 posts. And he got up there, and I didn't see this in advance. He got up there, and he just listed the posts, just the titles. Boom, 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 boom. It spilled onto 4 slides, and they were packed tight. There must have been 30 posts. I had no idea. It was just a blur to me. These things go out, I forget about them. We really beat the drum on that, and I think people and organizations that are successful in making change, that's what they do. They just keep at it. Choose words carefully. That's sort of obvious. Some words are going to work. Jargon's not going to work. Just pay attention to words. Connect your paragraphs. Okay, I have an example of that. And this example also shows another secret weapon, which I learned from my stepfather, although many of us learned it in school. Lead sentences. The first sentence of every paragraph. A well-written piece, if you read a well-written piece, you should be able to, if you only read the first sentence of every paragraph, you should get a good sense of the flow of that piece and what it's about. All the other sentences should just be supporting and sort of detail. I think this, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraph excerpt from some piece I did exemplifies that. I think everything about it is fairly simple. The paragraphs are connected, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I think the lead sentences are fairly clear, and you could just read them and get a sense of what's going on. So I'm just going to read this thing. A growing proportion of Medicare beneficiaries are opting out of the government-run insurance program. They're instead choosing a private plan alternative, one of the Medicare Advantage plans. The strength of this trend defies predictions from the Congressional Budget Office, and nobody can fully explain it. Actually, that was the lead paragraph, so this is right off the top of the piece. Here's another mystery. So right there, there's a connection between the 2 paragraphs. I didn't use the word mystery in the previous paragraph, but I conveyed it, right? There's something going on, and no one can explain it. Well, that's a mystery. Well, here's another mystery. So that's a connection between the paragraphs. Traditional Medicare spending growth has slowed, bucking historical trends and expectations. Though there are theories, we don't fully know what's causing that either. Next paragraph. Pinning down explanations for these 2 mysteries is important. So the word mystery comes up again, and I say there's 2 of them, and that was what the first 2 paragraphs were. There's a flow here. There's a connection. Pinning explanations is important. Doing so could help us understand the structure and cost of Medicare in the future. The mysteries may be connected by something that appears at first to be unrelated. So again, the word mystery is a kind of a connective tissue of this. Doctors and hospitals tend to treat insured patients the same way, regardless of what kind of coverage they have. A traditional Medicare patient admitted to the hospital with, say, pneumonia will receive the same standard of care as a similar but privately insured patient. From this, an idea emerges that links the two mysteries. At this point, I don't have to tell you how this is connected, the word mystery, but there's also some connective language from this, comma, right? You see this all the time. However, therefore, related, indeed, comma, there's lots of ways to do that, and it does help. Anyway, from this, an idea emerges. As enrollment in Medicare Advantage plans grows, so too do the plans influence over how doctors and hospitals, well, obviously this flows off the page, how they do what they do. You get the idea. And probably many of you have heard about this before, but we tend to forget, don't we? Especially when we're writing our academic papers, and that's what many of us do, and we get so used to that. We tend not to, and nobody makes us. I have never gotten a revise and resubmit that says, here are all the technical things we want you to do and so on and so forth. But please pay attention to your lead sentences. A reader ought to be able to read each one and understand what the paper's about. Nobody's ever told me that in a revise and resubmit because we don't care. We should care, but we apparently don't care in academia that our papers are readable and that they're good writing. And I am actually pretty irritated by that. But I tell you who will care is the editors of journals, editors of newspapers and other large media outlets. And if you send them a pitch of a piece or a draft of a piece, and you've got lead sentences that aren't related to the content of the paragraphs, and your paragraphs aren't connected, and the jargon is a mess, and the sentences are long, they care. And they're going to say, no, life's too short. I have too many things pitched at me. Not this one. I'm not taking it. So there it matters. All right. Those were all my secret weapons and my tips. I've got some other stuff to say. I better go a little more quickly because I want to get to your questions. So I may end up skipping some things. Apologize. Okay, so you've written the blog post or the column or fact sheet or whatever. Now what? Okay, so here's the theory behind what I'm really talking about more generally. Over time, research products and publications come out in journals, and different colors here are different topics. You can imagine like the journals are coming out and the papers are flowing out in this order of colors, right? And that order is random. When you start your research project, you don't know when that manuscript's coming out. Moreover, there's a very long time between submission and revision and then publication, and it's kind of a random order. Then going alongside that, we've got issues in the public debate, and it's the same issues, so it's the same colors, but they're in a different order. They're in the order that they happen to come up in the public debate. So if, say, entitlement reform of some sort is coming up right now, and that's red and on the bottom timeline, but your paper on entitlement reform, came out at a different time or is yet to come out, there's a mismatch there. So what you can do, and what I do with blogging and writing columns and even on Twitter, is when a issue is in the public debate and you are aware of work that you've done or a colleague's done that is relevant to it, and you want to play a constructive role in bringing evidence to the issues, you will resurrect that work and make it known to the public again, or for the first time, through another type of communication. So it doesn't matter that your study or that the seminal study on this topic was last year, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. If it's still relevant, if you can still speak to the issue with its content, bring it up again. That's why a press release that comes out at the time of the research publication, which is what all the universities do and what all the journals do. Hey, we have a new study. Here's a press release. That's why they're only so effective, if at all. Some journalists will be happy to write about a new study, particularly if it's very counterintuitive or newsy or whatever. But very often, a few weeks go by and they've forgotten all about it, even though the issues now come up. So that's what we should be doing more of, is resurrecting the important work when it's relevant. Okay, so another secret weapon. Another thing you can do in playing this role is emailing journalists, particularly if you've written a piece that they can understand. But you could sort of do this if there's a study, and it's for some journalists. There's a study that's relevant to kind of their beat or the what's going on. You could email them just about a study. And so my recommendation for emailing journalists, and actually this is more general, for emailing anybody who's busy, is, guess what? A 3-sentence rule. Make it 3 sentences. 3 sentences, quick, in and out. The subject line should be like a tweet. Make it as catchy and easy to understand what it's about. And then 3 sentences email, and then details here. So I've got some examples, but you can imagine having seen 3 sentences in the leads. These are all very old. So this is 2013. The subject is raising the Medicare age now saves even less. And this is back in the day when I was emailing a lot of journalists stuff from my blog. I don't do this much anymore. But the email is, we judged it the wrong way to reform Medicare before. The CBO just re-estimated the federal savings, and they're dramatically lower. Parentheses, they had made a mistake in an earlier estimate. So it's an even worse way to reform Medicare now. Details here. Journalists like that. They do not like the wall of text that PR firms usually send them. And I get these things now because I'm considered by some of these organizations to be a journalist. And a wall of text, they can't handle it. And okay, the wall of text is somewhat defensible if the first 3 sentences are like this and the details are below. Fine. But usually it's so bad. It's just, what is the point? They chuck it. They barely get past the subject line. The Oregon Medicaid study does not say Medicaid is a failure. A new study of Oregon's RCT of Medicaid finds mixed results. Mixed does not mean failure, and far from it. Aaron Carroll and I break it down in a new post. Link. Done. Okay, there's another couple of these. Yeah, you get the idea. Point being, nobody wants to buy journals, in the sense of they're not going to read them. You've got to get the stuff out there in another way and in a more timely way. All right, do I have time for this example? Okay, yeah. Let me do this example and get to questions. So what I want to convey by this is that there is a base, a foundation of research that we are doing and our colleagues are doing, and we're publishing as we should in peer-reviewed literature. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying definitely do that. It's important scientifically. It's important for your professionally, for promotion and so forth. But there's more we can do. So we do that. That's the foundation. And then there's these other things. So here's a concrete example where all these things were put into play. This is on contraception's cost effectiveness. There is a body of research on that topic. Okay, so that's the research literature, which practically nobody will read, even when it's timely, which it was a few years ago, and again more recently actually. So a research assistant I was working with, Daniel Liebman, read that literature, and he summarized it on my blog in a somewhat more accessible post. Still, it reads like a very thorough lit review section of a paper. Okay, so it's not terribly accessible, but it's much better than reading all the papers for accessibility. Then I took what he did and I turned it into an upshot column, but that was more accessible still. It didn't cover all the papers. It was more like, here's a stylized fact. For example, this study said this and this study said that. Never mind the 5 other studies, they say roughly the same thing. It was a little more streamlined, less jargony, get to the point, put it in policy context. That was key. And then we have emails, which I showed you and I didn't put on here, but also Twitter. So Adriana McIntyre, who's my blog's managing editor, an all-around smart, fantastic person. Here are just some of her tweets. Other people tweeted out too. So that's another way to reach journalists. I have other examples. Penn State's wellness program is kind of a similar story. I'm not going to go through it because we want to get to questions. Just a few slides and I'll wrap up on, does this really matter? Can you get attention this way? Well, yeah, here's a bunch of charts. This was back from a time period when Aaron and I were posting on the Academy Health's blog and then we were promoting it on Twitter and our own blog. And all those spikes here over this time period are all our posts and our promotions of them. So we were driving traffic to those posts. Similar idea here. A couple papers came out. Nobody looked at them, and then a blog blogged about them, and like traffic spiked on the attention to those things. I won't go through that in detail. More recently, so just to show this is not just me, although this example wasn't me either. Michael McWilliams. I'm not sure where he got the data, but he tweeted this out. The causal effect on page views of Harvard economists tweeting link to article 4 months after publication. So I guess Amitabh Chandra and David Cutler, and I don't even know what paper this is, but tweeted about a paper that Michael and others wrote, and it spiked page views, which is just, that's just a process measure, but it's some evidence that it matters. Okay, questions. All right. So I have received questions in the past, and some of them are here. And then I asked Zach if there were any other questions I should include, and they're here. But I would rather answer the questions that you guys have than the ones I'm ready to do. I'm just going to start. I'll tell you what. I'm going to start in on these, but can someone like interrupt me if there's a question out there that I should get to? But let me just start. These are very common questions, so many of you are going to have these. All right, if you're writing these kind of pieces, how do you include all the important caveats and methods? And methods basically don't. No methods. Okay, a little. Like, if it's a big randomized trial, you should say it's a big randomized trial, because people are going to kind of get that, and some people, if there's something else that lends itself to being a more credible study, maybe you can work it in, but mostly don't talk about methods. However, you can kind of mention it in caveats. Mostly don't talk about caveats in the sense of don't be thorough. Like, we know there's 6 limitations of this paper that are written in the paper, and then like 6 others that we could think of. You're not going to talk about all those. But you should say, if you feel this way, and that you could definitely say there are some limitations, for example, and give 1 or 2, especially if it's important, and especially if it lends it credibility that you're being fair. But basically, first rule of thumb is don't do any of these. Maybe do a little, but you have to be very judicious about it. Journal articles have a future. I already answered this. They absolutely do, or they should, because it is the foundation. You cannot do all the caveats and methods in these kind of pieces I'm talking about, and they are important to include somewhere as a scientific matter. So yes, they have a future. As for the business model of it, I can't speak to that. I'm just saying I think they're very valuable, and they're the foundation of everything I do. How do you pick one story from big evaluation? So it's very common. I'll read a whole paper, and there's, in this paper there are 24 interesting results, and it's a huge study, and I can't write about everything. So how to pick one story? Well, first of all, I think the first message is pick one story. Sometimes you can work in a few pieces of results, but you're not writing about the whole thing. It's too much. So something will jump out at you as being more policy relevant, being more connected to people, just being more interesting. If you were talking to your mom, presuming she doesn't know anything about this, and you wanted to get her interested, which one thing would you tell her? I can't say how to do it, but I can definitely say you should do it. What to pitch New York Times? So basically it has to interest New York Times readers, and there's a lot of things in research that just won't. And usually that means some things that are important policy-wise, they're not going to make it, because even though they're important, people aren't interested right now. Sometimes if it's policy important, you can still get it in because you can make it interesting, but it's not a question that people are already thinking about. So you have to come at it as like, a kind of thing they would want to say at a cocktail party, if they knew. So, hey, here's a kind of an interesting thing that you haven't thought about. But if it's not that, or something they're already wondering about, it's not going to happen. It's just not for that audience. Okay, these came from Zach, and they're sort of related, I think. How can we do a better job of measuring the impact of dissemination translation? What do you think for alt metric, which is, I think, related? And can we test these efforts in a rigorous way? Okay. Here's the problem. The easy ways to measure impact, and actually all those charts I went through really fast showing traffic, those are easy measures. The easy measures are not what we actually care about, and this is very common. Measuring traffic is easy. Measuring social media engagement is relatively easy. This is what altmetric's all about, although I don't know a ton about altmetric. I think this is basically what it's all about. If I'm wrong, someone correct me. They are very good for selling what you do. If you happen to have a blog and you want to get funding for it or kind of sell its influence, having those metrics is very handy to say, we have a readership of 20,000 a month, and our typical post gets this many social media engagements and blah blah blah, whatever. Great. But what we actually care about is policy impact and informing the debate, and that I think you can only get at with case studies. There's no measure I'm aware of that can really do that in a very good way. But I think compiling those case studies is worth doing. I am guilty of not doing it very well. Probably every time I have a conversation with a congressional staffer or someone at CBO or MedPAC, I should probably, and they say, and they'll email me, your piece on thus and such was very interesting. I'd like to talk more about this. And they're obviously in a position of some degree of influence in those institutions. I should probably be writing that down, not for public consumption necessarily, because some of it's off the record, but I should probably have those stories. And I think that's the best way. It's a little bit disappointing because it's not quantifiable. And how to test in a rigorous way, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have a good answer. But maybe if Zach and I talked about it some more, I'd come up with that. I'm wondering what he thinks. So I want to take your other questions. We have 7 minutes, approximately. If there are other questions. Meanwhile, you can look at this slide. The purpose of this slide, I'll keep talking until someone interrupts me, is that this was all from my experience. There's no doubt other ways to go about this and be successful. And if you have your own arsenal of secret weapons that works, great. I don't believe everything I think, in the sense of I have some humility about it. Must be questions. You can ask me anything. Hopefully my audio is I'm not hearing anything, so hopefully it's working. I'm checking my email in case someone's trying to reach me and say, we're asking you questions and you can't hear it.
Does everyone know how to unmute? So we're no longer receiving a presentation.
Or maybe you've all left.
Can you hear us, Austin?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, here's something in the chat box.
Okay.
How do you write early and peer review while keeping article content timely? Yes. Not totally sure. So there is an issue of what you don't want to do is write about work that you also want to publish later, because a journal might say, you already put this on the New York Times website, so we're not going to publish it. So you can't do that, or you write about a small piece of it that's going to come out later. But actually, this is all kind of beside the point, because I only write from published work. So it has to start from a publication, and that doesn't mean it's not timely, because like I said, issues that are relevant today, there are studies of the past that speak to them. It might be true that in next week there's going to be like the most amazing study on it, and maybe I know about it because I've done that study, or I know about it because the journal sent it to me under embargo, but I can't write about it yet, so I just don't. That answer the question? When your blog post is peer reviewed, does that delay? Yes, of course it does. Um, but academics, even academics, are very responsive to when I need things back. Now, usually I have a lot of time because I write things weeks to months in advance, and I'm usually telling them, I'm not going to file this piece for 3 weeks, so there's no hurry. They get back to me within a day or two. They're usually very excited. People love to have their work written about, or that of the community. Usually I send the piece to someone whose work I am writing about. It's not only about their work. I always reference a lot of different pieces. And often I ask for a quote, in large part because that's the easiest way to get their name and affiliation in the piece. I can't list every author on every paper I cite. I can't list every affiliation. So what I often do is, a study by several economists from Harvard says blah blah blah, and then I'll say later, Mike Chernow, Mike Chernow, one of the co-authors, said thus and such. So it's a way to get their name in there and their affiliation.
Austin, how do you write about your own work, your own scholarship?
Well, fortunately, this is not a problem that comes up very often because I'm not prolific enough to fill all the opportunities I have for writing. So, even if I publish a lot in a year, I've got way more opportunities at Upshot and JAMA Forum and elsewhere to write. Actually, at Upshot, they frown upon self-promotion in that way, so I have written about my own work. They'll accept it, provided I'm writing about other people's work too, which I think is sensible. So how do I write about it in the sense of what, not being too self-promotional, or what's the?
Is it different? I guess is it a different process than when you're writing about a topic that you're not as
Okay.
scholarly?
So if I am a national expert on what I'm writing about, and that does happen occasionally, it would particularly be on Medicare Advantage. I know a lot about Medicare Advantage. I've worked a lot on it. I can write, and I have written many pieces on Medicare Advantage without getting it peer reviewed because I don't need it. So I get things peer reviewed mostly when I'm not the national expert, or I really want to get someone's name in there, and I want their input. The other advantage is that even if I'm pretty sure I've got a perfectly fine piece, defensible, it's another layer of defense in that I might get attacked is too strong a word, some pushback on what I've written, and the pushback could be perfectly fine because there's lots of different interpretations of the evidence. But if I've had an expert review it, I feel confident that my position is at least reasonable. Maybe it's not, quote, correct because there's more than one correct way of interpretation, but is at least reasonable, and with confidence I can write back if I want to, or engage and say, fine points that you made, however, I see it differently, and I think what I wrote is fine. And sometimes that pushback doesn't come from me, it comes from editors. Sometimes the New York Times editors occasionally will get a comment or an email, and it'll lead them to ask, do we need a correction here? Someone says you're wrong. Do we need a correction? And I'll look at it, and sometimes I'll go back to the expert, and I'll almost often say, no, there's no correction necessary. This person either is misreading the evidence, doesn't know the evidence, or has a fine point, but my point is also supported by the evidence, so it's also perfectly fine. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Another question in the chat box: how do you build relationships with journalists? So the way this started is I was writing on my blog, and a colleague who saw what I was doing said, this is good, and journalists should know about it. And I said, I have no idea how to do that. And he said, well, fortunately I do, because he had a background in like political campaigns and community organizing and kind of outreach to journalists and so forth. He said, well, if you can get email addresses, just email it to them. And moreover, if you don't get traction on it, it could be that the piece didn't hit it in the right way. So just try again, which is a good lesson. So I wrote early. This is early on, a number of years ago, when I was writing a lot on my own blog. I would write about the same topic many, many times, in rapid succession, just saying the same thing in a different way. Sometimes with new evidence if I had it, and then emailing it to all the journalists I could get hold of. But once it caught on a little, then journalists were emailing me, what do I think about this? And I would build up an email list, and that's how I did it.
Probably have time for one more. Oh, there's one more chat box question. If you have several blogs on deck, how do you time your posts?
Oh, so the nice thing about having several things written is you can hold them until it seems timely, and there's no way to predict that. But with pretty high frequency, something comes up. I mean, it's not like the country's only talking about one thing at a time. Even in healthcare, it's pretty high frequency. Even if I wrote something that seems evergreen, which means you could publish at any time, it's sort of, it doesn't have to be published right now to be relevant. If I wait a month or two, which I can often do because I have that kind of stuff written in advance, something will come up to tie it to. A piece of legislation relevant to it moves. Somebody tweets something relevant to it. Some state tosses in a waiver application that's relevant to it. So I don't try in advance to predict, but if I've got 4 or 5 pieces kind of written or in process, very often the opportunities arise.
Well, that's great, and we are 3 minutes past the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's time. And thank you so much, Austin. I think this was, at least in our group over here who was watching raptly, a lot of nodding, and this was just really informative and exciting, even for those of us who think about this stuff all the time. So I guess we'll make sure that for the Cherish affiliates, this will be posted on the Cherish website, and we will make sure that everyone has your email in case anyone wants to reach out and let you know that. I guess we all have a homework to reply to Austin to tell him if we are interested or not interested in engaging in this type of activity after listening to you. And I think I know the answer for what most people are going to say, but